From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Normally every Friday, Jewish people all get together, all the family comes every Friday. And that Friday, for some reason, everyone had their own plans. I said, okay, I'm going to a friend.
It's a hot autumn morning, and a woman named Barbara Cohen is giving the Sunday Times reporter Venetia Mingus a tour of her former home, the kibbutz Kfar Aza, which sits on the border with Gaza.
So who was in your house that day?
Nobody was in my house. My two older children, they live directly opposite each other. My oldest son very quickly realised something wasn't right because of the amount of the barrage of rockets that were coming over. And he said to his sister, pack your stuff, I'm coming to get you. And she lives with two little dogs. So this was like 20 to 7 in the morning. He went out, took her. On the way back, they started shooting at them. So it was like literally within a few minutes of the rockets being launched, they were in the kibbutz. He stayed like 32 hours holding the door of the reinforced room. They had no food, they had very little water. So yeah, for 32 hours it was a nightmare.
But is now everyone in your family safe?
Yeah, we were really, really lucky. Whatever happened here, I mean I work here every day and I'm wandering around, but still it's very hard to accept it and to really comprehend what happened here.
A year ago today, Hamas launched a coordinated terrorist attack on Israel. At least 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals were killed. 5,400 were injured, and 251 were taken hostage and held in the Gaza Strip. These are stories of survival, of terror, of courage, of escape, and of the many loved ones who weren't so lucky. The story today: out of the fires, into the tunnels. How I survived October the 7th. Would you mind just starting by reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely. My name is Venetia Mingus, and I'm the assistant data editor for the Times and Sunday Times.
Venetia, you've just come back from visiting a kibbutz in Israel, very close to the border with Gaza. Just step back a second and just remind us what a kibbutz is, how it works, and what took you to this one in particular?
So kibbutz are essentially small communities that were originally based on utopian ideals of socialism and typically were very tied to agriculture and the land and farming. But today they contribute to a range of industries, but they remain very community-based. So even the structure of a kibbutz, the way it's laid out, is very community-based and oriented. So you might have an area where there's the elderly living together near some caring facilities, and then an area where people with families are close to a nursery, and then a separate area for maybe younger adults so that they can, stay up late and play music without disturbing the rest of the community.
A utopian village.
Yeah.
What took you to this one in particular?
So this kibbutz called Kfar Aza, which is only a few miles from the border of Gaza, was particularly badly hit on October 7th. 64 people were killed and 19 people were kidnapped, 5 of whom are still in Gaza, one of them being the only British-Israeli hostage.
And Venetia, when you enter this kibbutz now, what does it look like?
So there were 2 members of the kibbutz who showed me around. There was a young man called Guy Yacobi and a British-Israeli woman called Barbara Cohen.
Okay. Just burn down houses.
There's barely anything standing.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I take pictures
Yeah,
here?
of course.
It's very eerie. You can see that this was once a really idyllic place to live. It's very green, it's very quiet, but at the same time you can tell that you're at an atrocity site. The roads are destroyed by tanks. There are memorial posters everywhere for the people who have died.
Yeah, they've planted it now.
Is this in memory of the family?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What does this sign say?
It's written the names of Gila, Yisar and Danielle that were murdered here on the 7th of October.
So it's honestly like stepping onto the set of a horror film.
And did they give you an idea of what life used to be like in the kibbutz before October the 7th?
This is the best place ever, okay? If you had a bad day or you have problems at work or you have a headache, when in the minute you get inside this neighborhood, everything disappears because you live right in front of your best friends.
They described it as, living almost at a boarding school with all of your friends next to you, where you could have barbecues, music late into the night. You had an extended family, essentially.
And they also had a bit of a relationship with Gaza compared to other parts of Israel.
So is this the official border?
You can see the fence. You see the fence there? The peels.
If you look through your camera, you can see it.
Yeah, well, being so close to Gaza, especially for some of the older members of the kibbutz who had lived there for decades, they recall that before the fence was constructed and before Hamas was in control of Gaza, they used to have really close relations.
Yeah, before the Intifada and everything, most of the kibbutz houses here were built by people coming from Gaza. And there was very good relationship
34 years ago, my grandfather used to tell me that he was driving with his bike to the market in Gaza.
Yeah,
Yeah,
as volunteers we used to walk in and go and get pizza and hummus on a Saturday. And the best mechanics were there in there as well. People used to take their cars in to get fixed.
And I guess that there's a variety of different kibbutzes that range from how religious they might be to how secular they are. But on the whole, these are people who wanted to be close to their neighbours. They wanted to have a two-state solution. They wanted to coexist. But then at the same time, they are based on Zionist settler principles, that they are there because they want to live on that land. Actually, on October 7th, Guy was telling me that usually they have this festival, and one of the kibbutz's particular traditions was to fly kites from the soccer field right next to Gaza.
Each Simchat Torah we have a kites festival that we are getting up early in the morning. We're going to the dining room. We're starting building handmade kites.
What does it symbolize?
It's the meaning is like it kind of wanted to say that we are here. This is our house. This is our place. But we are, kites is kind of childish and very how do you say it? Innocent thing. That show that we are peaceful people. But this is our place, and we are here. To stay here, but we want to live in peace.
Does anyone live in the kibbutz now?
So we did bump into a couple who have been living there for the past few months. So are you one of the only people still living here?
No, now we are many people.
Mm-hmm.
We are almost,
How many?
I don't know, 40, 50?
Oh, yeah?
That's many.
It's, if you
When you compare it for
Compared
when
to
we arrived-
900.
For other people, they find it too traumatizing, or even if they wanted to go back, they don't have the necessary provisions. Their homes are destroyed. They don't have water or electricity.
we still find a lot of places that
Project in...
the pipes are broken or breaking. Or
But for you, it was important to come back.
Sorry?
It was important for you to come back.
Yeah. It is. For my luck.
Everybody was clearly affected by what happened on October the 7th. The entire kibbutz was ransacked, people were killed. Where were the people you met on the day, Barbara and Guy Jacobi?
Barbara and Guy were lucky in the sense that they weren't actually on the kibbutz on the day. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons that they were giving me this tour, because it was maybe slightly easier for them than those who had been there on the day. Barbara, instead of spending Shabbat with her family as they normally would, had gone to stay with a friend in a neighbouring kibbutz that was thankfully untouched on the attack. Her son was working in the military and they were en route to a different area of Israel that day, but started to receive text messages from the young adults from the kibbutz. And the young adults area was the closest to the Gaza fence, and it was one of the worst hit areas. So Barbara's son started receiving messages saying that they needed help, and he decided to turn his unit around and go back to the kibbutz to try and help. And they were actually one of the only units that got there whilst in the first few hours of the attack, and they were vastly outnumbered. And although Barbara's son survived, many didn't.
And what about Guy? Where was he?
So Guy was actually in Sri Lanka. He'd just finished his military service and was looking to enjoy a bit of time off and had gone there to learn how to surf. His family were in Gaza on October 7th, and when they heard the sirens go off and they heard the rockets, they thought that this was like any other rocket attack. They went to their safe room. But the problem with the safe rooms, they were reinforced and designed to protect you from rockets and mortars, but nobody had foreseen the idea that there could actually be a ground assault of Hamas members coming into the kibbutz. So none of the safe rooms had locks.
You couldn't lock them from inside?
No, you could open them from outside. So this left a lot of families in the position where they had to hold on to the door handle in order to try and prevent someone from opening it. And they would have to take turns between each other to do so. And Guy's brother, when they were in the safe room, was holding on to the lock, and Hamas had kind of caught on to the fact that people were doing this. So the first thing they did when they found a safe room was to shoot the door handles. They were trapped in that safe room without any food, water, or place to relieve themselves. And Guy over in Sri Lanka was frantically trying to get an update from other members of the kibbutz of what happened to his family. That must have been horrible being on the other side of the world.
Oh, and you don't know what I've been through. On between Saturday to Sunday, in 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., I've been told that my family got murdered, all of them.
He got a call from someone to tell him that his whole family had been murdered.
One of the officers of the unit that I've been connected to told me, we've been surrounding your house. We put a speaker outside and we called them, Jacobi family, this is the IDF, go outside. But they thought it's terrorists. And they started to push walls down because they thought there's a lot of terrorists inside, so they want to kind of scare them away or make them surrounded. So they pushed some of the walls. We didn't hear nothing, so apparently they're all dead. And then they left.
In shock, he essentially is trying to get to the airport to return to Israel.
We start moving back to the city where's the airport at in the Sri Lanka, and I'm knowing that my family are all gone. And around 12 I got a video phone call from my brother. Yeah, it was yeah.
And were your family okay?
Yeah. My brother got shot.
Thankfully, he finally got a video call from his brother to let them know that they were still alive and that they were still hiding.
It was like the rising of the death. Yeah. Those Sri Lankan civilians there thought I'm going crazy because I was screaming and crying and going crazy. Yeah.
That must have been such a moment for him. He was very lucky he survived, his family survived. Same with Barbara. But presumably they lost a lot of loved ones, a lot of people in the community.
Yeah. Walking around the kibbutz, every single house that we stopped outside of, there was a horrific story about what had happened to their neighbours, to their best friends, to their relatives. One of the stories that really sticks out to me was the story of a couple who went through an unimaginable journey.
It was Ariella that, it was looters that tried to get into his, it's a young family with a tiny little baby. They were in the safe room.
So this couple, they ran to the safe room, which was also their infant child's room. And at one point, Hamas tried to break into their safe room and they managed to not allow them to break through the door, but
they couldn't open the door, so they set the room alight. And
they, as they did to many other people, decided to smoke them out by setting the house on fire. So they were in this terrible position where they're thinking, do we go out and be killed or do we suffocate and burn alive in this room? And at one point, somebody threw in a gas canister to the room, and Eli, the mother, she was quick to act and she took a wet towel and threw it on top of it so that it wouldn't explode, which was a move that saved the whole family.
Wow.
But after a while, they realised that they can't just sit here, that they were sitting ducks, and decided that they were going to have to make a break for it, and literally ran through flames, holding onto their child to try and escape, and went from position to position, hiding in a bush, hiding behind a building, a shelter. They'd inhaled so much smoke. Burns covered the majority of their bodies. Their baby was crying, but they just kept going, covered in soot, in their underpants, running through the kibbutz. And eventually, when they found the IDF, she passed her child to a soldier and immediately collapsed, and they were airlifted to a hospital.
And did they survive?
Yes, I actually caught up with them at Sheba Hospital in Israel, where they were receiving rehabilitation and where Eli is actually working because she just qualified as a doctor before October 7th.
Our story is a small part of what happened that day.
It was a bit noisy. There was this sort of soft jazz playing throughout the halls of the hospitals.
We are the voice of the people that cannot speak.
They had to be in an induced coma for a few months and have gone through a lot of therapy and skin grafts in order to try and repair their skin. Eli is definitely the worst, has suffered the worst burns, but thankfully they're alive, they have each other, their child is doing well. And the strength of their love that got them through the entire ordeal was so obvious when you met them. It was left a real impression.
Then they sedate me and her and Ariel.
Yeah, I was sedated for 8 days. I was sedated for 10 days. And then I was sedated for 53.
Yeah. My lung collapsed.
And I understand the situation, but I always talk to everybody, she's gonna make it, because I know Eli and I know she's the most powerful people. Woman. She's the most powerful woman I know, and I'm sure she's gonna make it.
Those are remarkable stories of people who managed to get through it. Some people managed to survive but were kidnapped on the day. Did you hear about some of those cases?
Yeah. One of the stories that really stuck with me was that of a friend of Barbara's who was taken, and she did manage to survive. Her name was Aviva Siegel, and she was kidnapped with her husband of 4 decades, Keith.
The first minute, we went down underneath the ground. I looked at the people and I said, wow, these are terrorists. They're not just people. You're going to go through a lot.
I managed to speak to her, and she told me what happened when they were kidnapped and what life was like living in captivity in the tunnels underneath Gaza.
Venetia, you were telling us about somebody you spoke to who'd actually been held captive in the tunnels under Gaza. Where did you meet her? Tell me about how you managed to speak to her.
So I met Aviva in Tel Aviv inside of the Hostages Forum, which is right in the centre and has sprung up from civil society as a place where the families and relatives of hostages can come together, where they can eat, where they can support each other, and where they can advocate for the return of the hostages.
And what was her story? What happened to her on October the 7th?
So she was at home with her husband Keith in Kfar Aza, and they were hiding in their safe room like many other people were, but Hamas managed to break into her house and drag her and her husband from the safe room, and they actually kidnapped them and took them to Gaza in their own car.
And were there other hostages? Where were they held?
So they were taken on their own, but when they got to Gaza, they were held with other hostages, particularly a few young women who were held with them.
And how were they treated?
The treatment, as Aviva put it, varied considerably between the men and the women. She explained how they beat and tortured Keith and really took out their aggression on him and humiliated him. They had broken his ribs when they kidnapped him. Whereas with the women, they treated them like slaves. They would force them to pick up the food they dropped. They would force them to sweep, to cook for them. They tortured them both physically and psychologically regularly, making them live in pitch black and then taking a torch and shining it in their eyes when they were trying to sleep, forcing them to listen to the radio at maximum volume, playing mind games with them, taking out a gun and threatening with it in front of their face and laughing and then walking away, not feeding them for days, not allowing them to shower, forcing them to sleep on a tiny mattress inside of the tunnels. And Aviva described so many times thinking she was going to die of suffocation because there was just no oxygen in the tunnels, just lying on the mattress with Keith, trying their best to just focus on breathing and staying alive. And she describes this one horrible instance in which one of the younger women who she was held with was told by one of the Hamas terrorists to go with her to a bathroom, and when she came back she was visibly shaken and upset, and Aviva knew something had happened and she put her arms around her and they immediately started scolding them, telling each other not to touch each other. But that night she confided in Aviva that he had sexually assaulted her, and Aviva felt so helpless, not able to do anything for her, not able to protect her, not even able to hug her or console her without getting scolded by them. And I think just the uncertainty of not knowing what they were going to do next. You know, she would lie awake thinking, are they going to starve us again? Are they going to beat us? Are they going to rape me? What's going to happen? How long are we going to be here? And she was convinced that Israel had been conquered, that nothing was left, that they'd been forgotten, that nobody was coming for them.
We'll never ever go back to Israel. There's no Israel that Israel doesn't exist. And you just get the feeling that you've forgotten, because after somebody used to ask what day, how many days are we here? Yeah. 35 of us. And we used to look at each other, 35 days? We've been forgotten, nobody knows where we are.
And while they were held, were the Hamas fighters the only people she saw?
So most of the time, yes, but there were a few moments, they were moved multiple times she was only there for 51 days, but in that time they were moved multiple times. And at one point they were driving through the streets of Gaza and one of the Hamas members said, look around, look at this destruction, look what you're doing to us. And she describes only being able to see starving people, starving donkeys, just the smell of death everywhere.
And all the trash is all over. You see donkeys that look like skeletons and dogs and cats, trying to figure out if there's anything there to eat in the packets that they threw out.
And they were moved to a kind of family home of one of the Hamas members at one point. And she recalls this singular interaction that she had with a woman, a Gazan woman. At many points when they were being moved, the Hamas members would ask them to dress in traditional Arab style, which meant for her wearing a hijab. And they had asked, presumably their wife, to help secure a small pin that many people might use to keep their hijab in place. And it's quite an intimate act. This Gazan woman was face to face with Aviva securing this pin. And she said that she looked her in the eyes, dead in the eyes, and tried to really make her feel her pain.
Looked straight into her eyes. Straight into her eyes. I waited for her to look at me. And all what went into my heart I said to myself, how can she let her husband torture us like he does?
How did she look back into your eyes?
Yeah, she did.
What did you feel from her?
Maybe that she was with me. I don't know. It was strange. It was very strange, but I remember her eyes. I remember what she looks like. Maybe I felt sorry for her also, being there with him and not being able to have a way to say anything.
How did Aviva manage to escape?
So in November, there was a week-long truce in which just under 100 Israeli hostages were swapped for approximately 240 Palestinian prisoners. This was in a temporary truce deal that was negotiated by Qatar. And it was very uncertain. She didn't have any pre-warning that she was going to be released. She had no idea what was going on. They just came to her one morning and said, "Today, you, Israel." And she was reluctant to leave. She didn't want to leave without Keith, her husband, who'd been with her throughout this entire time. And one thing I found particularly moving was that Keith had refused to confide with anybody that he was an American citizen because he was convinced that the Americans would negotiate a separate release deal for just those citizens, and he didn't want to be released without her. So they had this real undying loyalty to each other, and she didn't want to leave without Keith. And she asked them, "I'm not going without Keith. When is Keith coming?" And they said, "Oh, tomorrow, next week maybe." But she didn't believe a word they said, and she was very reluctant to leave without him. But she realised at some point that she did not have a choice and that they were going to take her. And she wanted to say goodbye to him. She wanted to speak to him, and they wouldn't let her. And this prompted her, for the first time, to defy them. And just as they were preparing to take her out of the tunnels, she pushed them to the side aggressively and ran to the room that Keith was being held in and whispered to him, "Stay strong for me and I'm going to stay strong for you."
So I understood that it was one of the first times that I did not listen to them. But when he did tell me that I'm going, I begged him and I said, "I'm not going anywhere without Keith." And I begged and begged and begged until I understood that it doesn't help. And he said that, "Keith, don't worry, Keith, tomorrow." He said tomorrow or in a couple of days.
The last image she has is him lying in the corner of a room, staring at the ceiling, alone.
Do we know what's happened to him?
No. The last video that would be considered proof of life came from April, but as she said, even if you had a video from today that gave proof of life, it means nothing because he could be killed within 5 minutes.
Venetia, you've spoken to people who were there in the kibbutz on the day. You've spoken to people who survived. You've spoken to people who were kidnapped and have now survived. A year on, what do they want to happen now?
More than anything, they just want to bring the hostages home. They want, whether they're dead or alive, for them to be returned to their families.
Did you ask them about how they feel about the Palestinians now and about sort of a lot of the destruction that's happened in Gaza? I mean, you described how Aviva said she could see people starving. How do they feel about what's happened since October the 7th?
A lot of the people I've spoken to, despite the turmoil they'd been through and losing their own family members, had a lot of empathy for the civilians in Gaza and were really desperate not to see the cycle of violence repeat itself over and over. A lot of them who are parents said that they could never justify seeing children being killed, just as they don't think Hamas can justify killing children. And I think that a lot of them are feeling incredibly hopeless about the prospect of peace in the future, because so many people in both Gaza and Israel will grow up knowing that their parents and their family members were murdered.
I really, really want all the Palestinians that are good there in Gaza to have a better life. I don't think it's fair for them either. I think the world needs to pay attention to what could be, and everybody could be in a better place, and not what's happening and killing and war and you did that, so I'll do that. It should not be like that. It can continue forever.
Yeah.
Who knows what will happen? And who knows if Keith will make it, if he'll be strong enough, if he's healthy enough, what is he going through, if he'll ever get him back. Who knows?
On October the 7th, at least 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals were killed, and 251 were taken hostage. 65 remain in captivity and, it's hoped, are still alive. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, run by Hamas, at the time of recording, 41,689 Palestinians have been killed since October the 7th. Later this week, we'll bring you their stories from inside a year of devastation in Gaza. If you'd like to see Venetia's photos of the Kfar Aza kibbutz, you can find them at thetimes.com with a subscription. The Sunday Times has also put together an interactive gallery with the faces and stories of all 251 hostages. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer is Kate Ford, with sound design and theme tune by Mal Lassetto. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard, do get in touch. You can write to us at thestory@thetimes.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.